We invite you to join us today to find out the truth about these new controversial books. Welcome to our program. We're talking with two of the best, and Dr. Craig Evans from Acadia Divinity College and Dr. Gary Habermas from Liberty University. All right, we're talking about some of the most controversial books that are out and TV specials that are being made about them, and then the Da Vinci Code movie that's coming up. And there's some common themes that seem to be running through them about Jesus. Jesus is at the top of these topics, all right? Here you have Jesus didn't die on the cross, and here he did die on the cross, but the fact is his dynasty lives on through James. And then, of course, you've got the Da Vinci Code. And I want to follow up, guys, on something that pertains to these books, but that we left the folks with last time. And that is that you were talking about Paul's account in 1 Corinthians 15 about what happened at the beginning of Christianity, why Christianity spread. It had to do with the resurrection. It had to do with the fact of who he was in agreement with, who the eyewitnesses were, and then we need to talk about the kind of appearances that Jesus made to these men. So rehash that for the people that weren't with us. The fact is we're talking about Jesus comes to the end of his life, he dies, put into a grave, then stuff happens, okay? Paul recounts that, and why is it important what he says in 1 Corinthians 15?
Well, it's our earliest extended account, for one thing. And the point I made was it's a mere 25 years after the cross, 30-ish AD, 55-ish AD.
His book is written, Corinthians is written
1 Corinthians, about 55 AD,
right.
mid-50s. But Paul first gave this to them orally, he says, first two verses. So we got about a 20, 21-year gap there. But the key is that in 15:3, Paul said, I delivered unto you of first importance that which I also received. And the critical scholars who answer this question put Paul's reception of this back at Jerusalem. Now, some put it in Damascus, which, by the way, moves it back a couple years. But the most common answer is that he received this in Jerusalem from Peter and James at about +5. Paul's conversion plus 3 years later up to this trip. And in the context, both before and after, he's discussing the gospel. And at the first visit, by the way, the Greek term there, hysteresis, is often said to be a term of investigating data, sort of the investigative reporter.
Galatians chapter 1 is where he recounts his little trip up there, and this is where you find this word.
1:18. And so he's playing sort of the investigative reporter, according to several word studies, and he's interviewing, as it were, Peter and James. I assume asking, is your experience like my experience? Because Paul was solid on his. But then a few verses later, James 2:2, he goes back up there to make sure that the gospel he was preaching was true. And in Galatians 2:6, he said these persons, and now John is there, John, Peter, James, the brother of Jesus, he said they added nothing to me. And then in same three, John, Peter, James, in Galatians 2:9 and 10, give the men there, Paul and Barnabas, the right hand of fellowship. So there's an agreement. So I was drawing the conclusion, even critical scholars will say, now that's when he received the creed. It predates him because these men had it before Paul had it. And the Jesus Seminar says it predates Paul's conversion. Garrett Ludeman dates it at maximum of 3 years after the cross. James D.G. Dunn puts it in 30 A.D. So this is very, Gerald Collins, by the way, also moves a number of these back to 30 A.D., he says.
All right, let me interrupt you. What I'm saying is that before we talk about what's in that creed, the fact is the background of the characters that we're talking about. Why did Paul become a Christian? Because he was persecuting Christians to start with. What converted James? Why did he convert to Christianity when the fact is he was against his own brother all of the time when Jesus lived, okay? You got a stubborn brother. Okay, you got Peter that denied Christ, and he's depressed after the crucifixion. Okay, these guys all say something happened to them, and it's recorded in this creedal passage here. Keep going.
Yeah, of the big four there in Galatians 2, only John does not have egg on his face. The other big three, critics freely admit that James is an unbeliever before he admits the reason Jesus, at least at some point earlier in Jesus' ministry. You have Peter who denies him, Paul who goes after Christians, and they're all on board because of the resurrection. So at the core, on the gospel, that's what Paul lays before them, both in Galatians 1 and in Galatians 2, there's agreement. So there's not two strands in the early church. I'm sure there's periphery things in which they agree. Second half of Galatians 2, there's an argument. Barnabas and Paul, there's an argument. But in the central proclamation, deity, death, resurrection of Jesus, the earliest strand of Christianity agrees. People would like to say there's another strand there, but it's not our fault if everybody in the earliest strands agrees.
All right, Craig, let me pick it up with you here. The fact is that it's not just the fact of the resurrection, but the fact is Jesus actually appeared to these guys. Okay? Now, what that word appear means and the word vision means and sightings of Jesus, these books all have different interpretations of what that means. From the scholar's point of view, tell me what it means to you.
Well, the word appear can mean a lot of things, but what I find compelling is that the various people who saw Jesus, whether they believed in him or were indifferent toward him, or in fact, like Saul of Tarsus, opposed him, they interpreted the appearance in terms of resurrection. And I think that's very important. And in my view, that rules out the idea of a ghostly apparition or some kind of a dream vision. And of course, it rules out what I think is a nonsensical idea, a staggering, wounded Jesus wandering around looking for his friends and looking for medical help.